It's funny. When you think about the Ice Age, like, what's the first animal that pops into your head?
Oh, mammoths for sure.
Right. Those big furry guys.
Yeah, they're iconic.
Totally. But what's even more interesting than how they looked?
What's that?
Figuring out how they disappeared.
Oh, absolutely. It's way more complex than just like, oh, the ice melted and they all died.
Right. And there's this one spot that really throws a wrench in the whole thing. Have you heard of Wrangel Island?
Oh, yeah, that's where the last mammoths hung out.
It is. This tiny little island way up in the Arctic Ocean. Doesn't exactly sound like Mammoth's paradise, does it?
Not really, but it was home to them for thousands of years after they disappeared everywhere else.
So what's the deal with Wrangel Island? What happened there?
Well, it all started about 10,000 years ago when the ice sheets were melting and the sea levels were rising. Wrangel Island got cut off from the mainland, and a small group of mammoths ended up stuck there.
Small group. How small are we talking?
Really small. The genetic evidence suggests there might have been as few as 8 individuals that started the whole population.
8. Seriously. That's like starting a band with just a drummer and a bass player.
Yeah, it's a tiny gene pool. You'd think they'd be doomed from the start, right?
You would. But they weren't, were they?
Nope, not at all. They actually managed to survive and build a decent-sized population, like a couple hundred or so.
No way.
Yeah,
And for how long did they hold out on this little island?
they lived on Wrangel Island for about 6,000 years.
6,000 years. So they were doing something right. Did they have some kind of, like, super mammoth genes that helped them beat the odds?
Well, not exactly. They definitely faced some genetic challenges. Coming from such a small group meant they were dealing with a lot of inbreeding.
Ah, right. That whole thing where closely related individuals keep breeding.
Exactly. And that often leads to genetic problems, like a higher chance of harmful mutations.
It's like if you keep shuffling the same deck of cards over and over again, you're going to see the same hand over and over again.
Right? That's a great way to put it. Less variety, less adaptability.
Less room for, evolution to work its magic. So, if inbreeding was such a problem, wouldn't that show up in their DNA? Like, wouldn't we see this gradual decline over time?
You'd think so, right. But that's the weird part. The genetic analysis of the Wrangel mammoths doesn't show the kind of slow, steady decline we'd expect from inbreeding.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. So, we've got these mammoths on a remote island. They're dealing with some genetic limitations, but they're somehow making it work for thousands of years. What happens next in this Ice Age saga?
Well, remember, it wasn't just about the island. The world around them was changing too. The Ice Age was ending, temperatures were rising.
The landscape was changing
Yeah,
along with it, right?
Exactly. The vast open grasslands they were used to were transforming into forests. On the mainland, this was a huge problem for mammoths.
So, not only were they dealing with being this small, isolated population, but they also had to deal with climate change. Talk about a rough deal.
Yeah, no kidding. But here's the thing, on Wrangel Island, they actually adapted to this new Arctic environment pretty well.
Really? So they figured out how to survive on this, limited island with limited resources.
They did, and they managed to make it work for a remarkably long time, all things considered.
So they were thriving despite all these challenges. What happened? What finally did them in?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And here's where things get really interesting.
Here, tell.
It looks like their story ends not with a slow fade, but with a pretty sudden, dramatic event.
So no gradual decline. like we might expect.
Nope, not at all. All the signs point to something happening abruptly that wiped them out. Like they were doing okay, holding steady, and then boom, gone.
Wow, talk about a plot twist. So what are the prime suspects for this sudden extinction?
We're still trying to piece together the puzzle, but there are a few possibilities. One theory is an infectious disease.
Ah, right. Remember those genetic weaknesses we were talking about?
Exactly. If a new disease came along, maybe brought by migrating birds or something, it could have ripped through that population like wildfire.
So even though they managed to adapt and survive for so long, that underlying vulnerability might have been their Achilles heel.
It's certainly possible. It's like a hidden weakness that got exploited at the worst possible time.
Yikes. But what about other possibilities? Weren't we talking about environmental disasters too?
We were, and those are still on the table. Don't forget, these mammoths were a small, isolated group on a pretty unforgiving island. Anything that disrupted their balance with the environment could have been devastating.
Right? Imagine a fire sweeping across the island, or a volcanic eruption, or even a really bad winter.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Any one of those things could have pushed them over the edge. Even a single bad season where plants didn't grow well could have been enough to do it.
man, it's a sobering thought, isn't it? They could have been playing the survival game perfectly for thousands of years, and then one bad roll of the dice, and it's all over.
That's a great way to put it. It really highlights how vulnerable even the most successful species can be, especially when you're dealing with a small, isolated group like the Wrangel Island mammoths.
This whole story is way more complicated than I ever imagined. I always thought mammoths just died out because the climate got warmer, but it sounds like luck, both good and bad, played a huge role in their fate.
It definitely did, and the Wrangel Island mammoths really challenge our assumptions about how extinction works. Their story isn't just about a slow decline, it's about adaptation, resilience, and ultimately the power of chance.
It's incredible how much we can learn from these long gone creatures.
It really is. And what's fascinating is that their story has implications not just for understanding the past, but for how we think about conservation today.
That's a great point. I gotta say, the whole idea of analyzing DNA from creatures that have been extinct for thousands of years is just mind blowing. It's like having a time machine.
It really is. And the genetic data we've gathered from these mammoths, it tells us so much, not just about their past, but about the importance of genetic diversity for, for all species, even our own.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow. Why is genetic diversity so important? Like, what does that even mean?
Well, think of it like this. Genetic diversity is like the fuel for evolution.
Right.
It's what allows populations to adapt, to
Yeah.
change, to resist diseases, and just thrive over time. A species with a lot of genetic diversity, they got a bigger toolbox to work with,
Hmm.
especially when things get tough.
Got it. So a lack of genetic diversity means a smaller toolbox.
Exactly. And, in the case of our Wrangel Island mammoths, that limited genetic diversity, well, that might have made them especially vulnerable to those diseases we were talking about before.
Oh, right, like their defenses were weakened or something.
Right. It's like
Yeah.
they might have been able to handle the challenges they were, used to, but something new, something different that could wipe them out. Think of it like, think of a fortress with like weak spots in the walls. It might hold up against the usual attacks, but a new enemy, one that knows where to hit, that could bring the whole thing down.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's a little scary, though, when you think about it. Makes you wonder if there are other species out there right now that might be in the same kind of precarious position.
There are, unfortunately. I mean, a lot of endangered species today, they're struggling with low genetic diversity because of, habitat loss and other things humans are doing.
So their populations have gotten smaller.
Right, and that means their gene pool is smaller too.
So it's not just about saving individual animals, it's about saving their genetic legacy.
Exactly. We have to think about the long term. Make sure they have enough genetic variation to adapt, to thrive in a changing world.
Like we're trying to give them the right tools to deal with whatever comes their way, and without the right tools, well, they're in trouble.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about protecting individual species, it's about the whole web of life.
It all comes back to that. You know what else I was thinking about? We've been talking a lot about disease, but what about those other possible causes? The environmental disasters.
Oh, those are definitely still possibilities. I mean, even though they were doing pretty well for thousands of years, they were still a small population, and isolated, vulnerable to anything that messed with their environment.
Yeah, it's like walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
One wrong step.
Exactly. And when you're talking about environmental disasters, there are a lot of potential wrong steps. A fire, that could wipe out their food, a volcanic eruption, covers the whole island in ash, or even just a massive storm that lasts for days, weeks.
Wow, that's crazy to think about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, surviving in that kind of environment for that long, they had to be tough. But then in the end, something totally random could just wipe them out.
It's a reminder that, even the strongest, even the most adapted, they're not immune to bad luck. It's kind of humbling, actually.
It is. It makes you realize just how resilient life is, but also how fragile. And, it really highlights the responsibility we have to protect it all.
Absolutely. We can't control every random event, but we can work to, reduce the risks, give species a fighting chance.
Protect those habitats, make those connections between populations. It's all connected, right?
It is. It's funny. We're talking about extinction, the extinction of these incredible creatures, the mammoths, and yet we're learning so much from them about how to protect life today.
It's like their legacy lives on, not just in, fossils, but in what they teach us.
Exactly. The past can inform the present. It can help us make better decisions for the future.
And speaking of the future, we were talking earlier about genetic diversity and conservation. It seems like that's a big takeaway from this whole Wrangel Island mammoth story.
Oh, it definitely is. Understanding and managing genetic diversity, it's not just for mammoths, it's for all species. It's about being able to adapt, being able to resist disease, ultimately surviving.
So what can we do? Like, how do we take what we're learning from these mammoths and apply it to conservation efforts?
Well, I think the first thing is we have to recognize that genetic diversity, it's a precious resource. We have to protect it. And that means focusing on entire populations, not just individual animals, managing habitats in a way that promotes diversity, creating corridors to connect those fragmented populations. We can even use, genetic techniques to help restore some of that lost diversity.
Wow. So even though they're gone, these ancient creatures, they're still teaching us valuable lessons about the balance of life on Earth.
They are. Their legacy lives on, not just in the fossils, but in the insights they offer.
Before we wrap things up, I wanted to circle back to something you said earlier about the interconnectedness of all living things.
Yeah.
This whole Wrangel Island mammoth story It just really drives that point home, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Their extinction, it wasn't just some isolated event, it had ripple effects, and
Yeah.
today, the loss of any species, big or small, it has consequences.
We're all part of this big web of life.
Well said.
It's wild to think they actually managed to build a life on that tiny island, against all odds.
It really is. Shows how adaptable life can be. Even when things are, tough, there's always hope.
Makes it even sadder that they disappeared, doesn't it? After all that, something relatively small might have taken them down.
It is kind of a paradox. Life, it's resilient, but also incredibly fragile. It's a delicate balance, right? Everything's connected.
Like from the smallest little bug to, well, a mammoth. We're all part of this web.
Exactly. And when one part of the web breaks down, the whole thing's affected. It brings us back to conservation.
Yeah, it's our job to protect that biodiversity. Not just for the individual animals, but for the whole planet.
Right. It's not just about saving the cute and cuddly ones like pandas or whatever.
Every species matters. Every single one.
Couldn't agree more. Each one has a role to play, and losing even one, well, who knows what the consequences could be.
The mammoths, they're a pretty powerful reminder that we can't take nature for granted.
We need to be proactive. It's not enough to just set aside a few parks or whatever.
So what can we do? Like, how do we make a difference?
Well, it all starts with knowing what's going on, understanding the threats, habitat loss, climate change, all that.
Education is key, but that's not enough.
Right. We have to act too. Support the organizations doing good work, push for policies that actually protect nature, and make changes in our own lives. Reduce our impact.
I get that, but it's so big, this problem. It can feel overwhelming.
I know what you mean. But every little bit helps. Every action, if we all do what we can, well, it adds up.
Right. We can't give up. Got to keep fighting for the future of everything.
Exactly. The mammoths, they may be gone, but their story, it reminds us that life is both tough and fragile. We have to learn from that, protect what we have, make sure other species don't suffer the same fate.
Well said. This whole journey exploring the mammoths, it's been incredible. We've all learned a lot. And for all our listeners out there, if you want to hear some music that captures that Ice Age feeling, check out Valmask. It's by a band called Mammoth Weed Wizard Bastard. You won't regret it.